Poppy Nolan nearly tripped over her own feet when she saw him leaning casually against the brick wall outside Petal and Thorn, the tiny flower shop she passed every morning on her way to work. He was holding a single white peony in one hand, spinning it slowly between his fingers, eyes down, wearing a plain gray hoodie that shadowed half his face. Something about him made her pause. Maybe it was the way he didn't look like he belonged there. Not in that hoodie. Not with that flower. Not in this neighborhood. "Do you work there?" he asked suddenly, without looking up. His voice was deep, warm, and calm in a way that tugged at her chest. Like he already knew her. Poppy blinked. "No. I just like walking by. I like the smell." He looked up then and her breath caught. His eyes were the kind of blue that made you forget what you were about to say, framed by dark lashes that didn't seem fair on a man that tall and broad. He had a little stubble like he hadn't shaved in a few days and the smallest scar on his chin. "Same," he said simply, holding up the flower. "I like the smell too." Poppy gave the tiniest laugh. "You're standing outside a flower shop at 8 in the morning, holding a peony like it's a secret weapon. Are you planning to propose or apologize?" His smile was slow and full. "Neither. Just remembering." Before she could ask what that meant, he glanced at the storefront window. "They don't open for another 10 minutes. You've been waiting that long?" He shrugged, looking suddenly a little embarrassed. "I come here sometimes, just to buy one flower. I like this shop. It's quiet." Poppy tilted her head. "You live around here?" He hesitated. "Sort of." She laughed again, more out of nerves this time. "That's vague." He looked at her again like he was trying to decide something. "I'm Callum Ellis." He extended a hand. She blinked. "Just giving your name to strangers on the street now. I figured it was the polite thing to do, considering we've already talked about my flower choices and potential proposals." She shook his hand. His grip was warm. "Poppy Nolan." There was a beat of silence. "Poppy," he repeated softly, trying it out. "That fits." "Fits what?" "You," he said simply. She pulled her hand away, feeling the weirdest flutter in her chest. "Well, thanks. I'll take that as a compliment." She glanced down at her watch. "I should probably get to work." "Where do you work?" She narrowed her eyes. "Do you always ask people that?" "I've only asked one person that," he said, not missing a beat. She bit her lip. "I'm a receptionist. At a dental office down the block." Callum nodded like that made perfect sense. "And you like flowers?" "I do," she said, walking backward toward the sidewalk. "And you like standing around looking mysterious with peonies." He grinned. "Guilty." She turned to go. "Nice meeting you, Callum." "You too, Poppy." She didn't look back, but she smiled the whole way to work. The next morning he was there again. Same hoodie. Different flower this time, a pale pink tulip. "You again," she said. "You again," he echoed. "I was hoping you'd walk by." Poppy raised an eyebrow. "You waited here?" "I like patterns," he said. "And this one feels like a good one." That was how it started. Every morning for the next week she found him there. Always with a single flower. Always with that unreadable calm. They talked about little things, coffee preferences, favorite songs, the best pizza in the neighborhood. He never asked for her number. Never pushed. He just listened and smiled. And sometimes made her feel like no one had ever really looked at her before. And she told herself he was probably just some guy between jobs. Or maybe he worked nights. Or maybe he was just lonely. But something about him didn't add up. He didn't dress like the guys around here. His clothes were plain, sure, but the watch peeking out from under his hoodie one morning told a different story. It was sleek, black, and the logo on the face made her pause. She'd seen that brand in a magazine once. It cost more than her rent. Still, she didn't ask. And he didn't offer. And maybe that made it easier. Until Wednesday morning. She spotted him from half a block away, but this time he wasn't alone. A man in a navy suit stood next to him, clearly agitated. "You've got to stop coming here, Cal." The board's starting to ask questions. "I don't care," Callum said, voice low but firm. "I told you. I'm not going back. The suited man scoffed. You're walking away from a billion-dollar legacy for what? Some flowers. Callum's jaw tightened. It's not about flowers. The man grabbed his arm. It's about your father's company. The one you're supposed to be running. Poppy froze. She wasn't even breathing. Callum Ellis. Billionaire. Her stomach flipped. She turned to leave, but her foot scraped against the sidewalk, loud enough to make both men look over. His eyes locked onto hers and something shifted in his face. Poppy, she took a step back. You lied. I didn't. You let me think you were. She swallowed. God, I don't even know. Poppy, wait. But she was already walking away. The next morning, he wasn't there. Neither was the next. Or the next. She told herself it didn't matter. That she didn't care. That people like him didn't belong in her world, and she definitely didn't belong in his. But every morning she still looked. Until Sunday. She was coming out of the grocery store, fumbling with her bag of oranges when she saw him standing across the street. No hoodie. Just jeans and a dark coat. Hair a little messy. Eyes locked on her like he'd been waiting for days. He crossed the street without a word, stopping right in front of her. I'm sorry, he said. She stared at him, hugging the bag tight. Why didn't you tell me? Because I liked being just a guy to you. Not someone with 100 headlines and a boardroom and a last name people whisper about. She looked down. You're a billionaire. He nodded. Technically, yes. But you buy one flower. He smiled softly. Every day. It helps me remember what matters. She met his eyes. And what's that? He took the bag from her hands gently, like it weighed more than it did. You. This. Mornings outside a flower shop. Talking about nothing but meaning everything. That's what matters. Poppy blinked hard. You can't just say stuff like that and expect me to forget. I don't want you to forget. He cut in. I want you to know that I meant every word, every look, every morning. Even if I didn't tell you who I was. She was quiet for a long time. Then, you still got that peony? He grinned. I've got all of them. Dried and saved. Her voice cracked. Why? Because I was falling for you, he said. And I didn't want to forget the moment it started. She stepped back. You don't even know me. I've been learning you, he said simply. And I want to keep learning. If you'll let me. Poppy stared at him. At the billionaire who bought one flower a day and stood in the cold just to talk to her like she mattered. And then she did the only thing that made sense. She kissed him. Right there on the sidewalk. Oranges forgotten. The world forgotten. Just him. Just her. And the start of something that felt a lot like love. Poppy didn't see Callum for 3 days after the kiss. She didn't know if she was supposed to text him. Well, she didn't even have his number. All she had was that moment. His lips were warm, his hands gentle against her waist, and his kiss had felt like a promise, even if nothing had been said after. He had walked her home, quiet and close, but he hadn't asked to come up. He hadn't even lingered at the door. And now nothing. By the 3rd day, she tried to convince herself it had been a mistake. Maybe he'd gotten caught up in something impulsive. Maybe he'd gone back to his expensive world and realized she wasn't someone who fit into it. Maybe she was just a girl he talked to outside a flower shop for a while, a sweet distraction from whatever billionaire burdens he was running from. Then on the 4th morning, a sleek black car pulled up to the sidewalk in front of her building just as she stepped outside. The driver didn't say a word, just opened the back door and gestured for her to get in. Poppy froze. I'm sorry, you have the wrong person. The driver tilted his head. Miss Nolan? Mr. Ellis asked me to bring you. She hesitated. Where? He said you'd understand when you got there. Poppy looked at the open door, at the polished leather seats and the faint scent of something expensive she couldn't name. Every instinct told her to say no. But curiosity was louder. She slid in. The drive took 30 minutes. When the car finally stopped, she was no longer in the city. She stepped out into a quiet cliffside property overlooking the ocean. The air smelled like salt and pine, and a narrow path led toward a glass house built into the slope, seamless and modern, like it had been carved from the view itself. And then she saw him, Callum was on the terrace, hands braced on the railing, watching the waves crash below. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something in his face shifted like seeing her eased some private ache. "You came," he said. "I didn't know I was coming until I was halfway here," she replied. He stepped forward. "I wanted to explain." "You kissed me," she said, stopping him. "Then disappeared." "I didn't disappear. I needed time to prepare this." He gestured toward the house. "I wanted to show you something real before I asked for more." Poppy narrowed her eyes. "This is real." He opened the door for her. "It's not the house. It's what's inside." She followed him in. The interior was quiet, minimal but not cold. A canvas leaned against the far wall half-painted, all color and movement. A stack of sketchbooks sat beside it. In the corner, a turntable played something soft and instrumental. There were no signs of staff, no obvious luxury, just space, light, and a sense of stillness. "You paint?" she asked. He nodded. "It's the only thing that clears my head." "I thought you were supposed to be running a company." "I was," he said, "until 2 months ago." Poppy looked at him. "So you walked away? Just like that?" "My father passed last year. I took over because it was expected. But I hated it. Every second. The meetings, the press, the endless pressure to be the version of myself they wanted me to be. I didn't even recognize my own voice anymore." She crossed her arms. "And the flower shop? I went back there the day I quit. It was the last place I remembered being quiet. I stood there for an hour before I even bought a flower. And then I saw you." Poppy blinked. "You were already out when we met?" He nodded. "I didn't lie. Not about that." She walked slowly around the room, taking in the details. A stack of books on the side table, all worn and dog-eared. A photo on the shelf of Callum as a child, standing next to a woman with bright eyes and a wild smile. "Your mother?" He nodded. "She died when I was 19. I'm sorry. She was the only one who ever told me I didn't have to become like him. That I could be more than a last name. And now you're... what? Just hiding out in houses like this." "I'm trying to figure out what matters," he said. She turned toward him. "And you think that's me?" "I know it is." Poppy let out a breath. "Callum, you don't even know what my life looks like. I pay rent late. I microwave dinner. I have exactly one coat that doesn't have a tear in the lining." "I've never cared about coats," he said. "You say that now. But eventually the shine of this of me will dull. And you'll realize I don't belong in your world." He stepped closer. "Then I'll leave that world behind." Again, she shook her head. "It's not that simple." "You're right. It's not. That's why I wanted to show you this place first. Not the penthouse. Not the boardroom. The part of me that isn't in magazines or balance sheets." She was quiet for a long time. "You really gave it all up?" "I did. And I'd do it again." "Why?" "Because you made me remember who I used to be. Before all of it." Poppy looked down at the floor, then back at him. "Okay, so what now?" He smiled, not cocky, just steady. "Now I ask if you want to see what comes next." She hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of it." "I'm not asking for all of it," he said. "Just one day." She looked at him. "And if I say yes?" "Then we'll start small," he said. "Breakfast first." She laughed, surprised by how much she wanted to. He led her to the kitchen, where 2 plates were already set: scrambled eggs, toast, and sliced strawberries. Nothing extravagant, just warm, familiar food. "You made this?" she asked. "I had help," he said, pouring her coffee. "But I plated it." She picked up a strawberry. "So you're not completely helpless." "I can make toast," he said. "And I can find someone to show me how to do the rest." They ate on the terrace, watching the waves roll in. Neither of them said much, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the silence between two people who didn't need to fill space just to prove something. After breakfast, he showed her the studio. Paints lined the shelves, and canvases leaned against the walls. She walked past each one, noticing the progression. The earlier ones were dark, full of tension. But the most recent was different, softer, brighter. A woman stood in a garden surrounded by flowers. "That one's not finished," he said, coming up behind her. "Who is she?" He didn't answer. Poppy turned. "It's me, isn't it?" He nodded. "The first time I saw you, you were wearing the jacket. And you were looking at the window like it held a secret." She stared at the painting. "You remembered all that?" "I remember everything." She turned to him. "I'm not used to this. Being seen." She nodded. "Then let me keep seeing you," he said. "No pressure. No headlines. Just us." Her breath caught in her throat, but she nodded. "Okay." They spent the rest of the day there. He let her play music on the turntable. She asked him questions about his childhood, things he answered with a quiet honesty that made her heart ache. He asked her what she wanted, not just out of life, but out of tomorrow. She told him she didn't know yet. He said he'd wait while she figured it out. By the time the car dropped her back at her apartment, the sun was setting. She turned to thank the driver, but he handed her a small envelope. Inside was a key, and a single card handwritten. "For whenever you want to come back." She held it in her hand for a long time. Not a promise, just an invitation. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was standing on the outside of something. She felt like she was being let in. Poppy stood in front of her closet longer than she wanted to admit, staring at rows of neatly hung cardigans and sensible flats, trying to figure out what a person wore when they weren't sure if they were going on a date or stepping into a new life. She settled on a soft navy blouse and dark jeans, comfortable but not forgettable. The key Callum had given her felt heavy in the pocket of her coat as she stepped outside. She didn't call ahead. He hadn't asked her to. But something in the way he had given her that key told her she didn't need an invitation. When she arrived at the cliffside house again, this time by her own choice, her own steps, there was no driver waiting. No instructions. Just the sound of gulls overhead and the rhythmic pull of the tide below. She let herself in. The house was warm, the scent of cedar and something citrus lingering in the air. She heard music low in the distance, jazz, slow and smoky, and followed it until she found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour. "You're baking?" she asked, leaning on the doorframe. Callum looked up, surprised but pleased. "Only thing in this house that still intimidates me." "Is that your way of asking for help?" He held up a mixing bowl. "Do you know how to make scones that don't resemble hockey pucks?" "I've never made one in my life, but I'm excellent at Googling things I don't know how to do." He chuckled and handed her a wooden spoon. "Perfect. Let's fail together." They fumbled their way through the recipe, flour ending up on the counter, her shirt, and somehow in his hair. She didn't ask questions about the imported ingredients or why the butter came wrapped in gold foil. She didn't want to break the spell of normalcy. Callum watched her as she pressed dough into shape. "You always do that thing with your mouth when you're concentrating?" She blinked. "What thing?" "That little bite of your bottom lip. It's like you're deciding whether to scold the dough or compliment it." She laughed. "You're observant. I've noticed." They slid the tray into the oven and sat on the kitchen stools, sipping chai he made with real spices steeped in milk. It was a quiet moment, the kind that didn't need to be filled, but Callum broke it anyway. "I got my first job when I was 14, he said. Interning at one of the branch offices. My father wanted me to understand the business from the bottom up." Poppy nodded, waiting. "I hated it," he continued. "Not because of the work. Because I wasn't allowed to complain. I wasn't allowed to be tired or frustrated or confused. I was expected to be perfect." She tilted her head. "Were you?" "I pretended to be. For years. Until I forgot what it felt like not to pretend." Poppy set down her cup. "You don't have to pretend anymore." "I know," he said. "That's why you scare me a little." She blinked. "I scare you. You see through all of it. You never asked for the version of me I've spent years building. You looked at me like I was already enough." She reached across the counter, brushing a speck of flour from his cheek. "Maybe because you are. Callum's eyes softened, but before he could respond, the oven timer dinged. He grinned, standing. Moment of truth. The scones were imperfect, lopsided, a little too brown, but they laughed as they broke them open and slathered them with honey from a jar labeled in French. Afterward, he took her hand and led her outside. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with lavender and gold. They walked along the cliff's edge, silent for a while. Then he said, "There's a gala next week. A charity event. I used to go to these all the time, but this one's different. My mother founded the initiative before she passed. It'll be the first year I attend without her." Poppy's fingers tightened around his. "That sounds hard." "It is. But I want you to come with me." She stopped walking. "Callum, I'm not sure I belong at something like that." "You do," he said. "Not because of how you look or what you wear. Because you're the only person I want standing next to me." Poppy hesitated. "What if people talk?" "They will," he said. "But let them." She studied his face, the vulnerability in it. This wasn't a test or a performance. He was asking because he needed her. Not as an accessory. As a partner. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll come." His breath released slowly, like he'd been holding it without realizing. "Thank you." They walked again, slower now. The wind picked up, pushing her hair across her face. He tucked it behind her ear with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Later, as he drove her back to the city himself, no driver this time, just him behind the wheel of a sleek black car with silent acceleration and seats that smelled like new leather, she realized something had shifted. Not in the way he looked at her, but in the way she looked at herself. She wasn't visiting his world anymore. She was stepping into it. The night of the gala arrived faster than she expected. A package had arrived the day before, an evening gown in a shade of deep smoky blue, paired with heels so delicate they felt like glass. There was no note, but the card inside the box simply read, "You're not borrowing this. It's yours." She wore it with trembling fingers. Callum arrived at her door in a tailored tuxedo, his gaze sweeping over her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. "You look," he began, then stopped. Poppy flushed. "Say it." "Beyond," he said. The venue was a grand museum, marble columns and chandeliers glinting above an ocean of glittering gowns and polished shoes. Cameras flashed at the entrance, but Callum kept a protective hand at the small of her back, guiding her through like a shield. She clung to his arm as they entered the main hall. He leaned close. "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to. Just say the word." She nodded, but found herself surprised. The people who greeted him didn't look at her with disdain or judgment. They looked curious, and maybe even a little jealous. She met them with grace. A woman in emerald silk asked how they'd met. Poppy smiled and said, "Outside a flower shop." A man with silver hair asked what she did. Poppy told him about the dental office, about comforting kids who were scared of the chair. He laughed and said she had more courage than most people in the room. Later in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the band played something slow and aching, Callum led her to the edge of the dance floor. "I don't dance," she whispered. "You will with me." And she did. He held her close, one hand at her waist, the other laced with hers. Their movements were slow, not rehearsed, but natural. Like they'd always fit together this way. "Why me?" she asked softly, her cheek against his chest. He didn't answer immediately. "Then, because you never needed anything from me but me. And that made me want to give you everything." Her throat tightened. The music faded. The night wound down. But neither of them moved to leave. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her heart stopped. He opened it slowly. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, a single diamond set in platinum. No flourish. Just intention. "Poppy Nolan," he said, voice steady. "I've built companies and walked away from empires, but nothing has ever felt as real as standing next to you. I don't care about the headlines. I don't care about what people think. I just care about this. You. Us. Will you marry me?" The room hushed around them. She stared at the ring, then at him, and nodded, tears catching in her lashes. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and the world broke into applause. But she only heard his voice, whispering her name like a vow. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a girl from the outside. She felt like the center of something extraordinary. 3 months later, Poppy watched the wind lift the sheer curtains of the cliffside house as the ocean shimmered in the distance. The morning sun had just begun to warm the terrace, and she stood barefoot on the smooth stone, the silk hem of her robe brushing her ankles. She still hadn't gotten used to the quiet. Not the absence of traffic or sirens or chatter from the sidewalk, but the quiet inside her. The one that had replaced the low hum of not enoughness she'd carried in her chest for years. Callum was in the kitchen, humming under his breath as he poured coffee into 2 mugs. He'd started doing that recently, humming. It was a small thing, but it made her smile every time because it meant he was relaxed, present, not thinking about shareholder meetings or stock indexes or legacy pressures. They'd both changed. He handed her a mug with a crooked grin. "I accidentally put cinnamon in yours." She sniffed it. "You didn't accidentally do anything. You just like watching me pretend I don't love it." "I like watching you," he said, leaning against the counter. Period. She took a sip, hiding her smile behind the rim. "You say that like you still can't believe I'm here." "I can't," he said simply. She set the mug down. "You're going to have to get used to it." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing the ring on her finger. The diamond caught the morning light and threw it across the counter in tiny sparks of color. "We should set a date," he said. Poppy blinked. "A date?" "For the wedding," he said, as if it hadn't just dropped into the air like thunder. She blinked again. "Callum, we've only been engaged for 3 months. And I've known I wanted to marry you since the 3rd time you told me I was being annoying outside that flower shop." She pulled her hand back gently. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying, maybe let it breathe." He nodded, not offended. "Fair. He paused. "I don't want to wait too long to start our life. We already started it." After breakfast, she drove herself into the city. She kept her job, at least for now. It wasn't glamorous, and no, it didn't pay much, but it kept her grounded, gave her a rhythm, and reminded her she was still herself. She didn't want her life to become one long stretch of silences and luxury linens. She needed the contrast. But things had changed. People noticed the ring. Mrs. Holloway, the hygienist, had cornered her in the break room last week with wide eyes and a not so subtle, "Is that an engagement ring, or did you win a sweepstakes?" Poppy had laughed and changed the subject, but the whispers hadn't stopped. That was fine. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. Still, the shift was hard to ignore. She wasn't invisible anymore. That afternoon, when she returned to the house, a note was waiting on the kitchen counter. It was scribbled on the edge of a newspaper. "Meet me at the garden." She furrowed her brow. The garden wasn't actually a garden. It was a stretch of land behind the house, overgrown with wildflowers and tangled grass, where Callum had started planting things by hand. It was his newest project, something private, something slow. She followed the path behind the house, brushing past tall ferns and the low hum of bees. When she reached the clearing, she stopped cold. He'd built a greenhouse. It wasn't large or ornate. It was simple glass and steel, with moss creeping along the base and flower boxes lining the outside. Inside, rows of peonies bloomed in soft pinks and whites. He was standing in the middle of it, wearing jeans and a navy t-shirt, his hands streaked with soil. "You built this?" she asked. He looked up, sheepish. "With help. But I picked everything." She stepped inside, the air warm and earthy. "Why peonies?" "They remind me of the first day." She walked toward him, brushing her fingers over the petals. "You remembered the exact kind." "I remember everything," he said, "including the look on your face when you realized I wasn't who I seemed." She winced slightly. "That was a complicated day. You still came back." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Because I wanted you. Not the money. Not the house. Just you." "I know," he said. "That's why I built this place that's ours. Not part of the company. Not in the headlines. Just here, growing slowly." She touched one of the glass panes. "You're getting good at this metaphor thing. I've had practice." They stood in silence for a while, the only sound the shiver of leaves outside. Then she said, "I don't want a wedding that feels like a performance." Callum tilted his head. "What do you want?" "I want my sister there. And your aunt. I want daisies on the table and music that doesn't echo off marble. I want to wear something I can dance in, and I want you to laugh at the wrong time during the vows." He took her hands. "I can do all of that. And no press," she added. "None," he promised. A few days later, they drove upstate to a small inn with cabins facing a lake. The owners were old friends of his mother. They'd once hosted retreats for artists and writers, and now they mostly booked weddings in the warmer months. They stood in the open field behind the largest cabin, the late afternoon sun casting soft shadows across the grass. "It's quiet," she said. "Too quiet." "No," she said. "Just right." He leaned in. "I already asked the owners. They'll let us use the space for whatever we want. No rules. No packages. Just us." She turned to him. "You planned this." "I hoped." That night, they stayed in one of the cabins. It was small, with creaking floorboards and mismatched furniture, but Poppy felt more at home there than she had anywhere else. They made tea in chipped mugs, played card games on the bed, and talked about nothing and everything. She asked him things she'd never asked before. "What was your worst birthday?" He didn't hesitate. "My 16th. My father flew in a band I didn't like and invited 100 people I barely knew. I spent the whole night shaking hands with executives." She frowned. "That sounds awful. What was yours?" "My 8th, she said. "I asked for a cake shaped like a cat and my mom tried to make it herself. It collapsed before we could light the candles. I cried for an hour." He grinned. "Sounds like a better story than mine." "Maybe," she said, "but I would have traded it for a store-bought cake and no crying." They fell asleep with the windows open, the lake air cool against their skin. He wrapped an arm around her waist and whispered something she didn't quite catch before she drifted off, but it sounded like home. 2 weeks later, they stood in that same field, surrounded by 30 people and wildflowers cut from Callum's greenhouse. Poppy wore a simple white dress. Her sister cried through most of the ceremony. His aunt gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then immediately tear up. There were no photographers, no headlines, just the rustle of trees and the quiet knowledge that this was exactly right. Callum didn't laugh during the vows. He got choked up instead, and she reached out and took his hand before he could finish. Afterward, they danced barefoot under string lights, their guests sitting on picnic blankets and toasting with champagne in paper cups. Someone played guitar. Someone else brought sparklers. At some point, someone's dog ran through the field and everyone cheered like it was part of the plan. Later that night, long after the guests had gone to bed and the lights were dimmed, Poppy and Callum stood at the edge of the lake, the water still and silver in the moonlight. "I didn't think life could look like this," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Neither did I." She turned to face him. "You could have had anything. Why me?" He ran a hand down her back. "Because you never asked to be impressed. You just asked to be seen. And you made me want to be someone worth seeing." She kissed him, slow and certain. "You already were." They didn't go on a honeymoon right away. They didn't need to. The life they were building was already enough. They spent their days between the city and the coast, between quiet mornings and loud dinners with family. He kept painting. She kept working, eventually transitioning into a role that helped kids with dental anxiety, something she'd always wanted to do. The house on the cliff became more than a home. It became a place where things grew. Flowers, paintings, love. And every week, without fail, Callum brought her a single flower. Not always a peony. Sometimes a daffodil. Sometimes a tiny wild bloom he found on a walk. But always one. Always just for her. Because that was how it began. And that was how it would continue. Not with grand declarations or opulent gestures, but with one small, consistent truth: he had chosen love. And she had chosen him. The late spring air carried a chill that didn't quite reach beneath Poppy's skin as she stepped out onto the stone terrace of the cliffside house. The ocean below lapped in slow rhythm, the tide low and steady, and the clouds above carried streaks of rose and gold. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her waist, but it wasn't the air that made her shiver. It was the letter in her hand. She hadn't planned to read it. It had arrived the day before, addressed to Callum in a thick envelope marked in an unfamiliar serif font. She'd only opened it because he'd been gone all day visiting the city for a meeting with a former board member, something he hadn't wanted to do but agreed to out of courtesy. And now she stood frozen, reading the words again. The Ellis Foundation Board formally requests Callum Ellis' presence at the annual strategic session in Geneva. Attendance is not mandatory, but strongly encouraged. As the original heir and founder's son, his involvement still casts influence across all branches. She lowered the letter. It wasn't a demand. Not exactly, but it was a reminder that no matter how far Callum had stepped away, his name still held weight, and people still expected him to carry it. When he returned that evening, windblown and flushed from the drive, she sat with him over dinner, quiet, pushing roasted carrots around her plate. "You didn't eat much today," he said, not accusingly, just watching her. "I wasn't really hungry." He paused, setting down his fork. "What happened?" She reached for the envelope on the sideboard and slid it across the table. He didn't touch it, just stared at it for a long moment before looking up. "I wasn't going to show you that," he said. "Why not?" "Because I didn't want it to ruin what we have." "It won't," she said. "Not unless you let it." He leaned back in his chair. "They think I'm still tethered to all of it, that I'll eventually cave and come back. Do you want to?" "No," he said immediately. "But I don't want to spend the rest of my life dodging it either." Poppy nodded. "Then maybe it's time to stop dodging." "You think I should go?" "I think you should look them in the eye and remind them you already made your choice." Callum's jaw shifted. "You'd be okay with that?" "With me going? It's a few days. It's not forever." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "You've never asked me to be anything I'm not. That matters more than you know. You gave me space to be myself," she said. "I'm just returning the favor." He did go. 3 days in Geneva. She stayed at the house, working remotely with the kids program she'd begun managing part-time through the dental office's outreach initiative. It was still new, still growing, but it gave her purpose. She spent her mornings on calls and her afternoons in the greenhouse, trimming the now blooming rows of peonies and transplanting the baby herbs Callum had started weeks ago. On the second night, he called from his hotel suite, somewhere high above the lake with the city lights glinting behind him. "They're still trying to bait me with titles," he said as she sat cross-legged on their bed. "What did you say?" "That I already have the only title I want." She smiled. "Which is husband-to-be of the woman who taught me how to breathe again." The call ended with promises of breakfast together the moment he returned. But even after she hung up, Poppy sat there, clutching the phone to her chest, staring out the window at the stars over the sea. She wasn't afraid of the past pulling Callum back anymore. What she feared was what came next. They hadn't spoken about where they'd live permanently. The cliffside house had become their sanctuary, but the city still called to both of them in different ways. Poppy missed the bustle, the access to her work, and the way the streets hummed with stories. And Callum had started painting again with a ferocity that suggested he needed more than seclusion. The next morning, when he returned, she met him barefoot at the doorway, his duffel slung over one shoulder, his face unshaven and tired, but his eyes were bright. "I told them no," he said, dropping the bag. "No board seat, no silent advisory role, no honorary title. I told them I'd contribute through the foundation on my own terms. Privately. Anonymously." Poppy threw her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his shoulder. "I'm proud of you. I want us to start talking about where we go from here," he said softly into her hair. "Not just physically. Everything. What we want to build." They sat on the terrace that afternoon, notebooks open between them. Not a schedule. Not a plan. Just thoughts. Dreams. "I want us to live in both places," she said, sketching the outline of a building on the edge of her page. "Split our time. The house here and a small flat in the city near the program I'm building. You want to lead it?" "I do." Eventually. I've already started drafting a proposal for expansion. I want to bring dental care to kids in low-income neighborhoods, mobile clinics, preventative education. He studied her. You're incredible. I just want to matter. You already do. She looked down at her page. What about you? He tapped the side of his notebook. I want to open a gallery. A real one. I've been painting again. Not for therapy. For expression. I want to create something that connects. She reached for his hand. Then let's do it. Both of us. That summer, they bought a 2-bedroom flat in the West Village. It was sunny and small, with a crooked floorboard at the kitchen threshold and a narrow balcony just big enough for 2 chairs. They filled it with second-hand furniture, local art, and stacks of books that never stayed shelved for long. The foundation approved her proposal. Within 3 months, she had a team of 3, a donated van, and a rotating schedule of neighborhoods. She drove it herself on the first day, Callum in the passenger seat holding a thermos of coffee and laughing as she took a wrong turn and ended up stuck in a cul-de-sac. He opened his gallery that fall. The space was raw exposed brick, high windows, steel beams overhead. He painted the walls himself, hung his own pieces with shaking hands, and named it after his mother's favorite phrase, still waters. The opening night was packed. Critics came. Collectors hovered. But Callum stood beside Poppy the whole time, his hand warm on her lower back, his smile easy in a way that only she had ever seen. Later that night, after the last guest left, he locked the door, turned off the lights, and kissed her in the middle of the empty gallery, surrounded by his work and the echo of their laughter. A year passed. They got married on a cool April evening in the same garden behind the greenhouse, under a canopy of fairy lights and linen streamers. Just them, their closest circle, and the smell of new blooms. He wore a charcoal suit. She wore a dress with pockets. There were no speeches, no performance, just vows whispered in the hush of twilight. I choose you, he said, voice steady. Not just today, every day, in silence and noise, in stillness and change. I choose you, she replied, in all your forms, the man who brought me a flower every morning. The man who let me see the parts he thought weren't worth showing. They signed no press releases. They took no staged photos. The only picture they framed was one taken by her sister, a candid shot of them laughing. Heads tipped together, silhouetted against the string lights. They never stopped splitting their time. The cliffside house remained their place of retreat, where Callum painted and Poppy read for hours without interruption. In the city, they worked side by side, her with the foundation, him with the gallery, each carving their own paths but never walking alone. They never needed to prove what they had. They just lived it. A life built not on spectacle, but on presence. On shared mornings and soft confessions. On one flower at a time. One choice at a time. Always choosing each other.